This podcast is a Believe Network and Siete production. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce a man who is currently the beat writer with ESPN for the 2016 NFC champion Atlanta Falcons. And he is the author of the book that'll be released in March of 2025 called Say Hello to the Bad Guys: How Professional Wrestling's New World Order Changed America, the one and only Marc Raimondi. Marc, thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
My pleasure, Derrick. I am doing very well. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. When I first got wind of the book, on the old Twitter machine / X, whatever you want to call it,
hmm
having I don't want to say grew up because I was almost 18 years old when the formation of the NWO took place in 1996. But to have another perspective that's non WWE or non WCW, but somebody that is a wrestling fan that knew about it, and I wanted someone else's perspective because we've seen, obviously we have Eric Bischoff's 83 Weeks podcast. There's so many, obviously Kevin Nash has his podcast, and there's been so many stories that's been told on numerous WWE platforms. So it's good to get another insight, on this. So I'm definitely glad, and we'll talk about the book in just a second. But I just want to talk about first Marc Raimondi, the human being, the man. Growing up across I grew up in Newark, New Jersey originally. So you grew up not too
Okay.
far from me in good old Queens, New York. So talk about growing up in Queens.
Gosh, growing up in Queens, I think I always say that I feel very lucky because I grew up in the most diverse place in the country, right?
Mhm.
Maybe the world, right? There was, Queens has everything. It has every kind of person, every kind of culture, and
Mhm.
I grew up with that. And a lot of people have not, and I feel like that's a big advantage for me. And I feel like, I want to live places and be in places that are diverse and that have a lot of different cultures in it. Just moved to Atlanta, so I'm starting to assimilate into what the culture is here in Atlanta, and so far I'm really liking it. But that was Queens to me. Queens is a melting pot. Queens is I had friends from all over. From I had friends of every nationality, of ethnicity, race, gender, what have you, and
Mhm.
that was kind of Queens to me, and good food. I grew up in an Italian American family, and we had Sundays every day at my grandparents' place. The pasta with the red sauce, the whole thing, the
Mhm.
Italian bread, the whole deal. So that was kind of my life. Very very like middle class. Like my grandfather was an Italian immigrant, and he was a gardener. He was a landscaper, and then he ended up owning his own landscaping company. So sort of just kind of like your regular run of the middle class life.
That's amazing to hear. And I mean, like I said, I grew up, across from you in
hmm
Jersey, and it's like it's the same type of vibe, you know what I mean, in regards to how it was growing up in the era that you and I grew up in. You know what I mean? It was everyone was kind of sticking together and stuff like that. So I totally get that. When was it that you became a wrestling fan, and what promotions were you kind of latched onto?
Yeah, so I became a fan. My earliest memories of being a wrestling fan were like WrestleMania in 1990, Hulk Hogan against the Ultimate Warrior. Now,
WrestleMania
I think
6. Hmm.
Exactly, WrestleMania 6, and I feel like I was probably a fan before that. But though that's what I remember. Like I still have vivid memories of watching WrestleMania 6, and I was a big Ultimate Warrior fan, and that hasn't aged too well, unfortunately. But I remember getting the wrestling magazines, and I would go to the bodega, as we call it in New York. I would go to the
Hmm.
corner store in
Yes.
Queens, on 192nd Street in Queens, and Union Turnpike, and I would pick up every professional wrestling magazine that I could get. I would every time there was a store that had a magazine section, I would bolt right over to the magazine section and see what wrestling magazines were out there. So I got everything, and I tried to learn as much about wrestling as I could, even from a young age, because WrestleMania 6 was in 90, and I was only 6. I was 5. I turned
Right.
6 that year. I was born in
Mm.
'84, so I was pretty young when I first kind of got into it. And being from the Northeast, being from New York, obviously I was a WWF guy because that was the thing that would be most prominent where I was. Superstars on Saturday morning was a weekly staple. And Eventually, as I got older and I found out there was other wrestling, and I don't remember exactly how. Maybe I was just flipping through the channels and I saw TBS, and that's how I started watching WCW. Probably like in also the early '90s, because I remember seeing like Brian Pillman and Jushin Liger and guys like that.
Mhm.
Uh, some of the coolest things that I had seen as a fan. I was like, this is so different from the WWF. So those are kind of like my early memories, and one of my most vivid memories of wrestling was the incident, the angle with Jake the Snake Roberts and Damien and the Snake, and the Snake bit Macho Man Randy Savage when he was tied up in the ropes. And I
Oh,
remember this.
yeah.
I remember this. This is in 1992, and I remember this maybe even late '91
That
actually.
was
Now that I think about
91. That
stuff,
was 91.
yeah,
Yeah.
late '91.
Mhm.
This was just like the craziest thing to me. And being I remember being in my basement in Queens and having an argument with my uncle about whether or not wrestling was real or not, because I was like, I had just seen this snake bite a man's arm. That how can you fake that? That's real. And that's what I was saying. This is real. And he was like, no, 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 whatever. Uh, Fast forward, a million years later, and he just my uncle just pre-ordered my book last week, so that's about wrestling. That's pretty crazy, right? I'm actually gonna text him and say and ask him if he remembers that conversation, but I still remember it vividly.
Yeah, that was a crazy storyline. Just to hear about how far Macho Man was willing to go to get that story off the ground, being that he were going to do the whole reinstatement storyline because he had just lost the
Hmm.
career-ending match to the Ultimate Warrior at WrestleMania 7. And of course, they were trying to, hey, how do we reinstate the Macho Man? And of course,
Hmm.
Jake had that Cobra, latch onto him. And I'm just like, oh man, they're really going
Hmm.
there. So I totally get it. And you talked about going to the bodegas and going to
Hmm.
going to the magazine. I too did the same. That was our internet back then.
Yeah, 100%,
Yeah, if you
hundred
read the
percent.
aftermath, if you read the wrestler pro wrestling PWI, shout out to Bill Apter, who was a staple for all of our childhoods who were wrestling fans. I had an opportunity to meet him a few times, such an awesome guy. But you found out about more promotions than just the
Hmm.
WWF. You found out obviously WCW, then you heard about the AWA, then you heard about the World Class Championship Wrestling, and
Yeah,
then of
Smoky
course
Mountain. Yep,
Smoky
yep.
Mountain. Yeah, man. It was like the list goes on and on
Hmm.
about all these. I remember about reading about Pacific Northwest Wrestling back in the late '80s, and there was a guy named Scotty the Body who became Scotty Flamingo, who became
Hmm.
Johnny Polo, who became Raven. So I
Yep.
was following those guys in the '80s of when they were very, very young, in their careers. So it's good to see, for a lot of you young fans that got the internet at your fingertips with a
Hmm.
lot of Fightful and PW Insight and all that. We had just magazines to go off of and to find out about shows months down the road. But after you graduated from St. John's University in your hometown of Queens, New York, you covered sports as a part of SNY and USA Today, MMAfighting.com, Fox Sports, the New York Post, and now you're covering the Atlanta Falcons as a part of the ESPN family. And again, congratulations to you on your move to Atlanta, and I wish you all the
Thanks, man.
best on that journey. Talk about working for those media outlets and how
Hmm.
it catapulted you for what you're doing today.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think I have always preached the idea of kind of building that foundation. And what I mean by that is my first job out of college was at a weekly newspaper in Queens, New York, and I was covering mainly high school sports. A little bit of college and did a little bit of Mets here and there because it was in Queens, but it
Right.
was really mainly a job covering high school sports. And I don't think that I've covered anything harder than high school sports, because
Okay.
that was the definition of DIY, right?
Hmm.
You don't get there is nothing given to you in high school sports. You have to do everything yourself. You have to get all your own interviews. You have to get your own. You have to take your own stats. I'm walking the sidelines. In the winter football in Fort Hamilton, Brooklyn, with the wind coming off the water by the Verrazano Bridge, and it's freezing cold out. And
Yeah.
I have my I'm taking notes, And if you don't take those notes, you're not getting those stats, you're not getting that information. And that taught me a lot about kind of do it yourself and being a self starter, and not having to rely on other people. And I feel like I've tried to keep that mentality as I've kind of moved up the ranks, so to speak. And I eventually started working at the New York Post, like you said, and
Mhm.
I covered a little bit of everything there. Covered high schools at the start. Did some work in the office as a digital producer, as an editor on the website.
Mhm.
Covered some NFL games there. Covered Jets and Giants stuff. Covered the Giants for SNY. Covered the Mets for SNY. College basketball. I've done a bunch of stuff. I think I've done every sport you can imagine. From whether it be high school or college or pros. Like, I've even written stories about cricket. I've written about everything that you could possibly imagine. So I really think that has helped me tremendously in being well rounded and being versatile for what I'm doing now, because I was able to go from covering combat sports, which I did for 11 years, and I was
Mhm.
able to go over to the NFL team at ESPN, which I'm extremely grateful for the opportunity, by the editors there. And I've been received so greatly, honestly. The welcome has been great by the writers, and the other reporters on the team. And I just think that's really cool. I'm kind of like I'm living, I'm living my dream. I'm really living a dream, because I've been a combat sports fan my whole life too. I picked up MMA. I became a fan of MMA and the UFC because of pro wrestling. That Blockbuster Video with my dad looking for some wrestling tapes, right? Some VHS.
Right.
Saw this thing called the Ultimate Fighting Championship, and my dad and I, we swore that it was wrestling. We thought it was wrestling. There's no way this could be real. So we brought it home, and that's how I developed my fandom for the UFC. And then I ended up covering that. I've been an NFL fan for my whole life, New York Giants. Um, haven't been as much of a fan in the last few years, because I'm more of a journalist now. But
Right.
and I've been a wrestling fan. So I mean, I've wrote about the UFC for 11 years. I'm covering the Atlanta Falcons for ESPN, an NFL team. I mean, that's ridiculous. And I'm running a book by the NWO. I mean, that's like I can't even believe it. Like I'm saying, it's still surreal to me that I've gotten to do all of these things that 9-year-old Marc would be like, come on, this is no way, it's impossible.
Yeah, I hear you there, man. Because and we'll talk about MMA in just a second. Because even for me, granted, I have not traveled the roads that you have, and I'm not a journalist. I'm not. I happen to have a podcast, and I get to cover things that I love, which is pro wrestling, music, film and television, things of that nature. I got to cover WrestleMania in LA last year. WWE was very gracious to me to grant me press credentials for the entire week, and I'll be forever indebted to them for giving me that opportunity to at least get a peek behind the curtain as far as what goes on in covering events. When it comes to MMA, I found out about the UFC through cable back in the day and when 93, 94. And of course, when Ken Shamrock came to the WWF in 97, it
Mhm.
really shed light on the UFC. How much do you appreciate the leaps and bounds that MMA as a whole has taken over the last 20 to 25 years?
I mean, it's pretty crazy how far it's come, even since the time that I started writing about it and started covering it. Because I first started covering it for the New York Post in 2012, and I mean, it's a completely different sport now than it was then. The UFC
It
is
is.
different now than it was then. It's $1 billion industry, and they were successful in 2012 when I first started. But I mean, this is pre Conor McGregor, pre Ronda Rousey, pre like that boom that made them mainstream. This was pre Fox. They were still on Spike TV at that
Right.
time. So just to see, like, I feel very fortunate because I got to write about the UFC really in their formative years. I got to kind of see it from a period of time where they were doing well, but they were not mainstream. Two, I covered all of Conor McGregor's big fights, right?
Mhm.
I covered all of Ronda Rousey's big fights, and I've covered all of John Jones's big fights, and I've covered Brock Lesnar. So I feel like I was very lucky to have seen that progression, and it's just crazy to me now to see a Conor McGregor shirt out like in the wild, and UFC playing on TVs at bars that I'll go to, or restaurants that I'll go to, and
Right.
really it's become it's become something very much part of day-to-day life in the United States, and I don't think that, I mean, it was nowhere near that in 2012 when I first started covering it.
No, no, it wasn't. And I mean, granted, for us, MMA aficionados that actually watch the sport, and understand, all these different fighters from these different gyms, America Top Team, Rufus Sport, shout out to Duke Rufus out in Milwaukee. A lot of those are different, of course you got Wink out in
Jackson Wink in Albuquerque.
Jackson
Yep,
Wink out
yep.
in Was it Arizona they're at?
Albuquerque, New
Albuquerque,
Mexico.
New Mexico. Yeah. So it's like they're just following a lot of these gyms. I was doing that back then as far as with these upcoming fights, but I truly believe, and people can call me crazy, delusional, or just a big wrestling fan, but I think Brock Lesnar going to the UFC helped it become mainstream because here was a guy, who left. I was at WrestleMania 20, by the way, when he got booed out of the building because
Hmm.
he said he was leaving after the match with Goldberg. He tried the Vikings deal, and then of course, he starts going, he starts doing MMA, and he made an impact. Like people could say whatever. Oh, he got the title fight in what 3 or 4 fights, whatever it was.
Yep.
But he was a proven draw, and ultimately made a lot of he made them a lot of money. So I think now, people have to understand. Granted, we want to see the good fights and everything. That's great, but also there's also the business end of it too. Now you have a
Hmm.
huge conglomerate like Endeavor, with the TKO group, there's going to have to be they have to make those type of decisions is what's going to be best for business at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with you. I do think Brock Lesnar was a big part of, the steps that the UFC took to get mainstream, because after Brock Lesnar kind of came Ronda Rousey, after Ronda Rousey came Conor McGregor, and now it's on ESPN, and it's again it's mainstream. And I think a lot of people didn't think that it would ever get there, but it got there in a relatively short amount of time if you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I still remember the first Ultimate Fighter. And you know where I'm going. The fight that everyone was calling each other was like, "Do you see this
Hmm.
fight going on? Was it Stephen Bonner? What?" And was it Ryan Bader?
Forrest
Forrest Griffin,
Griffin.
my bad. Forrest Griffin and Stephen Bonner, and we're just
Hmm.
like, and Dana ended up giving them contracts. It was like
Yep.
it was just something you thought you would never see, but thus, here we are. So I think it was just building blocks that the UFC was doing to be, definitely what it is today. Now, before, writing this book, and we're gonna segue into wrestling in just a bit, were there any pro wrestlers that you had an opportunity to interview
Before the book or for the book?
before the book?
Yeah, I mean, for ESPN, I did cover a little bit of wrestling. I wrote some features, and Cody Rhodes is a guy that I've interviewed a bunch of times. A very very good guy. Uh, I interviewed a bunch of people like around WrestleManias, Seth
Hmm.
Rollins, Sami Zayn, Kevin Owens, people like that.
Hmm.
Interviewed Rey Mysterio and Dominic Mysterio before WrestleMania a couple years ago in LA, like you
LA,
mentioned.
yeah.
Gosh, that was last year. God, it feels like longer,
I
right?
know, right?
So yeah, so I had the opportunity to interview a decent amount of wrestlers uh, before doing the book, because through ESPN, because I was covering. ESPN doesn't cover a ton of professional wrestling, but enough. I did some AEW stories too. I did a big
Mhm.
story on John Moxley when he went to rehab when he came out. Did a big story
Yeah,
about that for ESPN.
right.
And of course, I did some stories about CM Punk that were a little bit controversial. So I've interviewed CM Punk a number of times as well, going back to his days in the UFC.
Nice. See, and that was another thing, people can say what they want about Punk, and I'm a big Punk fan,
Mm-hmm.
and not many people could take that walk to the octagon. Not a lot of people could do that.
100%.
And
100%.
the fact that he put in the work, it was just the fact that it was just maybe 15 years too late. You know what I mean? And I think
Yeah.
he realized it, but he appreciates his sport. He does the Cage Fury commentator he
Yeah, he's
does,
good. He's good.
and understands the sport. And I think, hey man, if he can contribute in that way, hey, more power to him. So
100%.
so now we're going to talk about, again, the topic here is the book, but we're going to talk about kind of a chronological a little bit because the beginning days of the New
Hmm.
World Order, the NWO, and we get talking about the book. In your estimation, when were you watching WCW like full fledged at that time when it happened?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Absolutely.
because
Absolutely.
all of this started really, I'll never forget. I was watching Super Brawl 6. That was February of 96. And Gene
Okay.
Orfalin he had the hotline, was it 1-900-909-9900.
Hmm.
I didn't dial the number, guys. Just letting you know, I didn't dial it. But he was talking about how two former World Wrestling Federation champions
Mm.
are making their way to WCW, and a lot of the dirt sheets and everything was talking about it being Scott Hall and Kevin Nash, formerly Razor Ramon and Diesel, making their way to WCW. Then, of course, we had the May 19th house show at Madison Square Garden and the infamous curtain call that happened when
Yep.
it was the end of a cage match with Shawn Michaels defending the championship against Diesel. Next thing you know, there's Triple H and there's Razor Ramon come making their way to the ring. They all hug and they're raising and everyone's seen the
Hmm.
fan cam and they're like, oh my god, because no one was really breaking kayfabe back then. That was a huge no. You know what I mean? And it
Correct.
was just crazy to think about now in the world of WWE, in pro wrestling, where you see wrestlers, babyface and heel, hanging out all the time. But during that time, that was a huge no.
Hmm.
So, and then of course the following week on Nitro, was it Mike Enos that was in the match? It was just an enhancement match, and all of a sudden you saw Scott Hall making his way down in that infamous that jean vest and cuts
Hmm.
that promo. What were you thinking at that time? As young Mark at that time, like what the hell's going on?
Confusion, a lot of confusion, and I don't remember exactly what I was thinking. I was definitely watching. There's no doubt. I remember watching like the first Nitro in 1995. I actually have vivid memories of watching the first Nitro from the Mall of America because I was so excited it was going
When
to be
Luger
another
showed
prime
up.
time, wrestling show. And I don't remember exactly what I was thinking when I watched Scott Hall, but I know that there was intrigue. I know there was intrigue, and I know that there was like, all right, what is going on here? What like all right, I'm hooked. You got me for a few more weeks, because I was probably still at that point more of a WWF fan, just being
Hmm.
from New York, right?
Right, makes sense.
Um, but I was definitely watching both shows. I was addicted to the stuff. Like I was like obsessed with it,
Same
and
here.
I remember being very intrigued and being like, all right, this is something that has my attention.
Yeah, and I mean, a couple of weeks later, Nash shows up behind
Hmm.
Bischoff, and they said, "We're not here to play." The measures that's changed around here. You're looking at it.
Yep,
That promo. Then, of course, there's a Great American Bash that took place. Well, I believe it was in Baltimore, and of
it
course,
was in
they were
Baltimore.
trying to
Yep.
figure out who that third man was, and then, of course, they end up powerbombing Bischoff through the stage, and I'm just like, whoa. I mean, it's to the most, the fan is like, oh, the average fan is like, that stuff kind of, but for us, it's like, whoa. They're crossing some boundaries that we've
Hmm.
never seen before because they're asking, do you work for the WWF? And they said, no, we don't work there. So in my mind, and again, we're not, there's no access to the back like it is
Exactly.
now. So all we're seeing is everything that's on television, and we're like, oh, they're invading. Or is Vince? Because remember the billionaire Ted skits that was happening earlier
Of
that
course,
year.
yes.
So is this retaliation on for in WCW and say, hey,
Hmm.
you want to steal our stars? Okay, cool.
Yep.
And it was working to make it think that WWF was looking to attack WCW stars for real, especially
Hmm.
when you have Bischoff, who is not a professional wrestler at all, take that bump. Unbelievable.
That was rare because you didn't really see a lot of non-wrestlers or non-managers taking bumps like that in
Right.
1996 or
No,
before. That was an oddity. I mean, how many ring announcers took bumps before? I mean, how many play-by-play announcers took bumps like that
not many.
before Bischoff did it? It was very rare. So yeah, that was something that definitely was on my radar. Like I definitely watched Great American Bash, and that was like, okay, they took it to the next level. Where does it go from here? And what's next? What is going on here?
Right. And of course, that sets up the six-man tag at Bash at the Beach. And all you see there is just Hall and Nash. And we're like, who is the third man? And everyone kept wondering who was the third man. Of course, there's I love hearing 83 Weeks and with Conrad. Shout out to Conrad, the Podfather, doing the incredible things over at adfreeshows.com. Him and Bischoff had were talking about, leading up to, Bash
Hmm.
at the Beach, and the rumor and innuendo of, I think it was Meltzer that put out that Mabel was supposed to the third man. This is no disrespect to Nelson Frazier, God rest his soul, but just the mere fact of like it was all this speculation of who the third man was, and all of a sudden you see the red and yellow coming down.
Hmm.
Now, no one ever thought, even in 1996, up until that point, that Hulk Hogan was going to turn heel.
Hmm.
And my God, that leg drop heard around the world. I often wonder if social media was around in 1996, what would have happened? Because everybody was calling. I was calling my
Hmm.
friends. I'm like, Hulk Hogan just turned bad. You know what I mean? I wasn't into the lingo and stuff back then, but
Yep.
it was unbelievable. I couldn't believe it. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I did exactly what you did. So I remember I was 11. I was still pretty young,
Hmm.
and it was a Sunday, and the next day was Monday, and it was summer, and I
Right,
was going to a camp,
right.
and I think maybe I was even like a counselor in training or something. I don't
Okay,
even I forget exactly, or maybe I forget if I was a camper or a counselor at that point at 11. But what I do
right.
remember is everyone talking about this. I mean, everyone from the campers to the counselors. This was Bayside, Queens, New York, day camp, and the whole camp was talking. This It was a buzz with the fact that Hulk Hogan turned bad. Like, what the hell just happened? What is going on here? And these are early memories. Like, it's funny, and this as a wrestling fan, and these are the kind of things that I want to kind of come get across in the book too. Is like these are memories that kind of leave like a lasting impression on you as a human being.
Agreed.
Not just as a fan, but it's like these are things that you remember that stick with you and stick in your mind, and they help shape you and form who you are as a person. And it seems like such a small thing, but like I really, I had that real visceral memory of being at camp that day and talking with people about Hulk Hogan turning. And it's like I don't have a lot of memories from when I was 11 years old, but you know what? That's one of them, and that's a big deal. That's a real thing.
Yeah, I was actually watching that pay-per-view with my grandmother, because my grandmother, and my God rest my grandmother's soul, she also was very much into professional wrestling like my mom was. My
Nice.
mom kind of pulled back after a while, but my grandmother was very much into it. My grandma, you want to talk about, she bought in, she was PO'd, man, of the fact that how could he do that? And this is the
Hmm.
same woman in the 80s who would throw her shoes. Whenever Ric Flair was cutting a promo, she would do one or two things. She would either turn down the volume or throw the shoes to the TV because she couldn't stand them.
That's incredible.
But she was hooked. You know what I mean? So
Hmm.
the fact that everybody was talking about, even kids in my neighbor, my friends in my neighborhood, we were all talking about it. Like that summer, we're like, what world are we living in right now that Hulk Hogan went to the dark side? You know what I
Hmm.
mean? It was incredible. So of course, they're showing up and all this other stuff, but then they're doing those paid announcements. You know what I mean? And they're doing all these vignettes. It was something new. You know what
It
I
was so
mean?
different. It was
It
so
was.
different. Yeah. Hmm.
It was shot in black and white, number one. That really kind of, it was like a lean in moment of like, what are they talking about? And it was just all these little tongue in cheek, you know, comments that they were making, how they were going to really take over the world. Number one, going back to Batch at the Beach, when all the trash that was thrown in the ring, when Hogan, um, cut the promo, naming the NWO, in your mind, what do you think led to them naming it that versus something else?
Gosh, it's one of the things that I wrote about quite extensively, especially like in the beginning, and actually kind of really the whole run, is just that it was really flying by the seat of their pants. There was not a ton of real planning. I think Eric Bischoff had, an idea of what he was going to do with Hogan, and then, well, Hall and Nash, and then Hogan, once Hogan got on board with being the third man. I think he had a little bit of an idea of what he was going to do, and then the vibe that he wanted it to be. But the name New World Order was, I mean, no one could really point to whose idea was necessarily. So the stories that I've heard, and from the reporting that I did, the first person that ever said New World Order on WCW programming, do you know who that was?
Hulk Hogan.
No, it wasn't. It was actually Larry Zbyszko
Mm.
on Nitro 6 days before Bash at the Beach.
Ooh, I have to go back and
He
watch that.
said New World Order. He said, but he didn't. It was kind of more of a description than
Description,
actually
right?
naming the group. He
Taking
said this
over,
is like
right?
a New World Order, right?
Right.
Um, I went back and I watched over 500 hours of WCW
Okay.
for the book to research the book, and because I wanted to know these little details, and that's a big one to me. So I asked Eric Bischoff about that, and he said that he remembers telling Hulk Hogan at Bash at the Beach backstage when they were going over the promo called the New World Order. And he said for years he did not give Larry Zbyszko credit for it because he didn't realize that that's where he heard it. He felt like it was something that he came up with, but it turns out that Larry Zbyszko was actually the guy who indirectly came up with the name.
It's almost like how Arn Anderson named the Four Horsemen in a promo where he just literally said, when you
Yeah,
read about the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, and he ultimately named
yeah,
them the Four Horsemen, which is still one of the most legendary groups of all
of
time.
course.
So let's talk about the book now. So let's talk about the process of when Simon and Schuster, first contacted you
Hmm.
and that whole, as far as approaching you about writing this book. How did it all go?
So I'm sitting in a hotel room. It's 2021.
Hmm.
It's I think it was May, and I was in Houston, Texas.
Okay.
And there was a UFC fight that week, and I was there covering it. I think it was Michael Chandler versus Charles Oliveira, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
And
The
and
Bronx.
yeah, so I'm there. It's like the Thursday, I think, of fight week, and I'm in my hotel room. I'm on my laptop, and I'm writing an article. And I get an email from an editor, or someone who says they're an editor from Simon and Schuster, and they're asking me if I want to write a book about the NWO. And I had written about the NWO when they went in the UFC, when they went in the WWE Hall of Fame
Right.
in 2019. I wrote an article for ESPN about that. Interviewed Kevin Nash, interviewed Hulk Hogan for that story. And I guess this editor, shout out Yadon Israel, tremendous editor, tremendous guy, was a wrestling fan like us from Brooklyn,
Okay.
from the New York, New Jersey area like us. So he was coming into Simon and Schuster in 2021, and he wanted an NWO book because he knew the kind of power and the kind of cultural effect and impact that it's had. So I guess he went looking for who would be a good author for this book,
Okay.
and he found my article about the NWO going into the WWE Hall of Fame. And he read it, and he realized, like, I mean, I could have written like a 400-word story about this, right?
Right.
I styled a little bit. I went off. I think I wrote like 2,000 words about this, which could have been like a small blurb, right? And he noticed that, and he was like, all right, this guy, he obviously has the knowledge and also the passion and the enthusiasm for this topic. So he just cold emailed me. I'm in Houston, Texas, and I think and Derrick, I think this is BS. I think this is like, there's just no way. It's like
Right. Too good to be true.
it's a weird time because, like, I just started traveling again after the pandemic. I think it was only like my second trip, and I was having some personal things going on at the time. I was going through a
Mhm.
breakup.
Mm.
I wasn't even living in my apartment at that time. I was living with my parents for a brief amount of time.
Mhm.
Weird time in my life. And I get this email, and I'm like, this can't be. This is not real. So I Googled him to see, like, all right, who is this person? Am I getting, like, am I going to click a link and get like hacked or something? Like, what's going on?
Right.
So I find out. I mean, I look him up, and it's legit. And email him back, and within a matter of minutes, we're on the phone together, and we're talking, and we're not just talking, but we're vibing, we're speaking each other's language, like, right away.
Hmm.
Like, he's talking about the impact. I'm talking about how, what it has meant, the significance. Because this is not just a wrestling book. This is a cultural book. This is a
Yeah.
pop culture book, and it's a sociology book, in many ways. So we're talking about those aspects of it, and kind of what wrestling is, and kind of like you know, my feelings about what wrestling is and what wrestling can be, and how wrestling is all around us. And he was like, "All right, get a book agent, write a proposal, and let's go. Let's start this process." So I did that. It took me a while. I didn't get the book proposal in until like 2022 because I was very busy with my job at ESPN.
Right.
And yeah, the rest is history. I signed the deal with Simon and Schuster in 2022, and they gave me, thankfully they gave me enough time to do all the work, and also maintain my regular job as well. And here we are now. The manuscript has been done since December. So the few things we gotta figure, we gotta hammer out before it goes to production. But that's the whole process. It's been a hell of a 3 years, 3+ years now.
That's incredible, man. Sometimes, when opportunities knocking, what's the old expression? You stay ready so you don't get ready. And I mean,
Hmm.
clearly you've been ready for a very long time and doing all that you've been doing, leading you up to this opportunity, coming, coming your way. And I mean, again, all the things you're passionate about, being the fact that you guys are vibing on the phone immediately speaks
Hmm.
volumes. You know what I mean? The wrestling community could be a very dysfunctional community sometimes, but it's almost like, okay, nope, we can mess with each other, but nobody can mess with us. So
Hmm.
that's kind of that ideology when it comes to the wrestling
For
community.
sure.
Now, you mentioned Eric Bischoff, who was, again, the brainchild behind a lot of that era, during that time. But talk about
Hmm.
the in-depth research that you did do, for the book. Were there any other WCW, not only just talents, but, executives who provided insight on what that whole, era was like during that time?
Yeah, I mean, I talked to I mean, first of all, like I said, I watched over 500 hours back, and
Mhm.
I read all of the newsletters from that time, the Dave Meltzer, and by the way, he did eventually have that Hogan was going to be the third man. It right before it happened. The
Right.
Mabel thing was I mean, the guy writes like 50,000 words a week. I don't know how the hell he does it. Honestly, he's a phenom, Dave Meltzer.
To this day, I mean, for over
So
40 years, he's been doing it.
for longer than I've been alive. I mean, it's just insane. I mean, there's no one like him. So uh, I did all that research, and I interviewed almost 100 people, and some of them were people that didn't want they didn't want their names to be put in the book.
Sure.
But Eric Bischoff is the guy that I interviewed. I visited him in Wyoming. I sat with him for like an entire day,
Awesome.
and we just talking about the NWO for hours and hours and hours, and so many different people, from producers to camera people to production assistants to directors to everyone that I could find who was there at that time. Obviously, a lot of wrestlers as well, quite a few of those. So yeah, I mean, and also people that not just people who weren't there necessarily, but who were impacted by it in different communities, in different sectors, whether it be, I talked to a Hollywood producer, I talked to a presidential candidate, I talked to sociologists, I talked to people who are experts in their fields and other things, and that's how I don't want this to be just a wrestling book. I want this to be bigger than that because I really do feel like the NWO has had a bigger effect than just on wrestling fans, even if they don't even realize it.
Yeah, it was life changing for a lot of people,
Hmm.
not just the talents, but I mean just the thought process of we're
Yep.
gonna we're gonna shake up the system and we're gonna do something our way. The fact that they were trying to get their own television show, NWO
Hmm.
Saturday Night, like I said, those vignettes were top notch, chef's kiss, being able
Hmm.
to really set the tone for what this was going to be. You know what I mean? Now,
Hmm.
with that, with a lot of those interviews and a lot of the in-depth research that you had to do, what were some of the biggest challenges you faced writing this book?
I mean, one of the biggest challenges was just honestly the time, because I have a full time job, and I had a full time job at that time that's pretty demanding, and it required a lot of travel.
Mhm.
So I'm in a hotel room for a UFC fight week, and on my laptop for 2 hours in the morning watching Nitro from 1997, and then when I wrote the book like for pretty much half of last year I took and I wrote the book, and I'm trying to churn out as many words per week as I can, while on the road and while I really had to stay disciplined. The time management was a really big thing, and thankfully the people in my life uh, didn't want to strangle me too much because I was working so much. Like, thank goodness for my wife Wendy. She's amazing and so supportive, because I mean you could see how closing yourself in the room for hours after work
Right.
could be not the most pleasing thing to a partner. But yeah, so I've been very lucky to have also ESPN has been so understanding too, and I have to shout out my editors there, because they were so helpful, and I didn't take a lot of time off necessarily, but when I did need to take a few hours here and there, they were very accommodating with me, and I didn't feel like my work at ESPN fell off, and I hope they would corroborate that too, on that side of things. But yeah, that was the biggest thing, just the time management of it.
Yeah, and it really goes to show you, at the end of the day, as far as how you're able to compartmentalize everything, as far as what your workload and everything else. And that just
Hmm.
shows you, and look at the opportunity that you have now, working with the Atlanta Falcons. And again, congratulations on that move for sure. With the NWO, there's the topic of cool heels. I was just listening to the Masters class on Busted Open Radio. I listen to Busted Open
Hmm.
every day. Shout out
Hmm.
to Dave LaGreca and the crew there for doing amazing work. As a hub for wrestling, for passionate wrestling fans. They listen to that show every day. But every Sunday they have a podcast. It's about 30 minutes long, and it's him, Dave, Tommy Dreamer, Mark Henry, and Bully Ray. And the topic was cool heels and how the shades of gray happened in wrestling.
Hmm.
Do you think that the NWO should be the poster child of what cool heels were, or do you think were there some cool heels that you saw when you were younger before the NWO, or do you think that you hold the NWO at the top of the list of being cool heels?
Yeah, that's the cool heel, and that is a great question, and I do think there was definitely, let's put it this way, it was very complicated, because Kevin Nash and Scott Hall were the epitome of the cool heel. They were bad guys doing bad things, but they were so damn cool and charismatic and engaging that you couldn't help but root for them. You couldn't help but cheer them. I
Right,
mean, that's just the way it was. No matter the heinous thing they were doing with baseball bats or attacking people backstage, they were just too cool. I mean, they were just great at, they were really just playing themselves in a sense, and they're just
right.
cool guys. But Hollywood Hogan was not really a cool heel.
No,
Hollywood Hogan was a real heel. Hollywood Hogan was the guy getting booed and the guy getting stuff thrown at him, and it was a complicated, complex group in that way, because there were different reactions from fans to different people in the group. And even if you go later on, like a Scott Steiner, like, he was not a cool heel. Scott Steiner, he was very much a traditional heel. Him and Buff Bagwell and their whole shtick, like, that was hated. That was obnoxious. People really hated it.
hmm
And Kevin Nash and Scott Hall were not. Sean Waltman was not. Although I know there's the whole X Pac heat thing, but at the time he was rolling with those guys. They were the Wolf Pack,
6 Pac,
and
yeah, man.
yeah, exactly. And they were super cool, and you did not want to root against them. But like the NWO T-shirt, right? It's cool. They're the heels, and they're outselling everybody. You know, it didn't happen very often. And I know that the Four Horsemen were heels, and the Freebirds were heels, and they were popular, right? They got cheered, but this
Right.
was a national level with the most people watching wrestling on cable television ever, and they were front and center. So Kevin Nash and Scott Hall, the Outsiders, they're the epitome of cool heel. The group itself, it's a little bit more layered and complicated than that.
Yeah, and I mean, when I think what I was just at WrestleMania, in Philly, not too far from where I
Hmm.
live, and I was at WWE World, and they had all these posters of like all the champions in the past,
Hmm.
and I just was looking at Razor Ramon. And I said he has to be the coolest mofo that ever
Hmm.
stepped in the ring. He
100%.
oozed cool. He oozed
Yeah.
to coin the phrase. He oozed machismo because he was so committed to that, and then going to WCW as just Scott Hall. But man, it was just his swagger. You felt it through the television. You know what I mean? And that's what I
Hmm.
enjoyed most about his. And by the way, he has one of the greatest working punches in the history of the business. Just amazing. But you mentioned it.
Facts.
Talk about merchandise. And
Hmm.
like, think about this for a second. If you go to a WWE show, if you go to an AEW show, if you go to MLW, if you go to Impact, if you go to any wrestling
Hmm.
show, you'll see Austin 316 and NWO.
That's right.
Talk about the impact of the merchandise and that they're still selling 28 years later now. Talk about that for a second.
It's just crazy because it became the NWO shirt first, and then later the Austin 316 shirt.
Hmm.
They became more than just wrestling shirts. They became this is just a cool thing to wear if you're a teenager, you're a 20 something. It was cool. It was the
Right.
cool thing to wear in 1997, in 1998. The Wolfpack shirt, the red and black. Yeah, that was just it was the first time that in like at least the 90s in a lot of people's lifetimes that wrestling was actually cool. Like it was not something that you got made fun of if you were watching it. It became something that everyone was watching, and it was pop culture. It was the water cooler talk on a Tuesday morning after the Monday Night War the night before.
Hmm.
And that's really what it was. And that has really not gone away all that much. The Austin 316 and the NWO shirt are, I mean, I'm wearing my hoodie here. I got this from Hogan's Beach Shop
Okay.
down in Clearwater, Florida.
Hmm.
And I'll give you a great example of
Yeah.
this, Derek. So I bought this when I first started doing the book, when I was trying to track down Hogan in
Hmm.
Florida. Didn't really work out in my favor, but I did get the hoodie. So I started to wear this when I traveled to UFC events,
Hmm.
and I wore it a lot at the airport. I wore it in different cities, just as kind of like a social experiment in some ways.
Right.
And I do wear a lot of wrestling shirts anyway, so it really not a big departure from what I would normally be wearing.
Right.
Anyway, so so uh, one morning, I'm in LAX and I'm flying to Newark, New Jersey, your hometown.
Okay.
This is last year, 2023, for a UFC show in Newark, and I'm
Okay.
flying to Newark, and it's one of those West Coast to East Coast flights. So I'm gonna be in the air all day pretty much, right? And it's early in the morning. I think it's a 6 a.m. flight, so I'm there. It's like four something, and
Right.
I'm tired. And I didn't get much sleep, but I know that I'm already tired. I'm going to a long fight week, and I got a book to write, by the way. So I'm wearing my NWO hoodie, and I'm going through TSA. And as I'm going through TSA, the TSA agent starts humming the NWO theme song as I'm coming through the metal detector.
Rock House. Nice.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is real. I mean, I swear to you that this really happened. I put my bag on the belt. I'm walking through in my NWO hoodie, and this man is freaking singing. He's humming the NWO theme song, and when I come through the metal detector, I get the Wolfpack. I get the Too Sweet, right? I mean, like that's insane. I mean, that is insane. And really, everywhere that I went and I wore this, someone said something. I mean, I would say it's like 80% of the time, if I'm out with this thing somewhere in the country or the world, someone is making a comment about the NWO. And that also extends, by the way, to Japan. I was in Tokyo about a year and a half ago, and I went to a restaurant, and the host, Japanese, did not speak much English, but he remembered the NWO. I mean, this is something special. This
Yeah.
is not your regular thing. This is culture. This is people, and that just further inspired me, and kind of like made me say like, all right, I guess I'm doing something right if I'm writing a book about this.
Right. And I mean, there's been times I wore this t-shirt out, and trust me, if I'm in a mall and I see a guy across the hall, he's like, too sweet. And he,
Yeah,
throw up the
every
sign.
time,
It's
right?
like,
It's like,
and there was I was with my best friend and his fiance now, and then that happened in a mall one time, and they're looking at me like, the hell? I'm like, you don't
yep,
understand. To your point, it is culture because that's what
yes,
we know. That's what we do. You know what I
yep,
mean?
100%.
And that's what I enjoyed most about that time. And think about this for a second. The Bullet Club, in New Japan, they took a lot of that
Hmm.
NWO when they throwing up the too sweet. And that t-shirt is another shirt that you see at a lot of
Yeah,
indie shows, a lot of Bullet Club. And I think and that was an extension of the
hmm,
NWO and the impact, and it was a huge impact, not just in America, but just all over the world.
yeah. It's just wild, to think that something that happened almost 30 years ago has still had that impact. But that's really the premise for the book, and I know I've said it a few times already. But it's more than just pro wrestling. The book is about more than just pro wrestling. The NWO was about more than just pro wrestling. There were so many elements of it that elevated it past just your typical pro wrestling storyline, your typical pro wrestling group. It transcended the medium, and it still does today. And that's very much like you said. You go out, and more times than not, someone is making a comment on this shirt. I wear a lot of shirts, and I traveled a lot for 11 years covering the UFC. Nobody's making comments about other shirts that I'm wearing, but at the end, they see the NWO shirt. It's just a different level. It is something different, and I tried my best to do this subject matter justice with my writing, and I hopefully I have. I think I have, but hopefully I have.
Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, you can get, this book. Like I said, like, you can pre-order it right now. I'll get you can give you that information in just a second. Again, say hello to the bad guys. How pro wrestling's new world order changed America. And if you could just tell the people where they can pre-order the book so they'll have it right and ready in March of 2025.
Yeah, I mean, really anywhere that you pre-order books, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, it's on Target's website, which I kind of that blew me away actually when I saw it on Target. Like Target is like it's Target. So really anywhere you pre-order books, you can Google it. Like the title you said, "Say Hello to the Bad Guys: How Pro Wrestling's New World Order Changed America." Also, you can check it out on my social media. My X, my Twitter is at Marc Raimondi, MarcRaimondi. Instagram is Marc Raimondi Sports, MarcRaimondi Sports. And it's all on there. The links are on there. A lot of information is on there. And will continue to be over the next few months, as we get closer to publish. And yeah, it's just crazy that these years of work, it's a passion project, for me. It's finally like, it's becoming a reality. It's pretty moving, honestly.
Yeah, man. Like I said, I can't wait to
Moving me to cough apparently as well.
and as I said, I definitely can't wait to read it. One more thing before we head out. I know you're a beat writer for the Atlanta Falcons. So talk about, your expectations, now that you're writing for the team. Now they have Kirk Cousins that just signed a 3-year contract, with the Atlanta Falcons, and they've made
Mhm.
drafted a quarterback in first round. You know what I mean? High, everyone was high on. So talk about the realistic expectations going into this football season with the Atlanta Falcons.
I think that a lot of people would say that they are the favorites to win the NFC South. And look, it's been a while since they've had a winning season. 2017 was the last one. Matt Ryan was the quarterback then, and he was the franchise for 14 seasons. And they did not really have a good succession plan for him at quarterback. And I think that really is one of the reasons why they wanted to draft Michael Penix when they did. Even though they just signed Kirk Cousins, it was a big money contract, but quarterback is such an important position. And it really can be the difference between winning and losing in a lot of cases in the NFL these days. That's just how the game has evolved. And they were super high on Michael Penix Jr. They went to his workout. A bunch of coaches went to his workout in Seattle, and they just loved him. They loved him. They loved his arm. They loved his ability, and they loved who he was as a person. which I've gotten to see a little bit too so far during OTAs and rookie minicamp and veteran minicamp, and he really is he's a very humble guy. Very humble guy. Uh, Seems like he's ready to sit and learn for the time being, and learn how to be a leader in the NFL, learn how to be a franchise player possibly in the NFL as Kirk Cousins does his thing. But it was controversial because they did not do anything in the first round with the number 8 pick to make their team better in 2024. So, I mean, I understand why that was a polarizing pick, but in 3 or 4 years, if Kirk Cousins has a couple of winning seasons under his belt and then passes the torch to Michael Penix, who is a ready-made, possible future franchise quarterback, I think a lot of people are going to be saying like, all right, maybe we were wrong, and the Falcons actually had some prescience, so to speak, and they kind of knew what they were doing all along.
Because to be honest with you, I initially thought, especially during bowl season, I thought that Michael Penix, I thought that that was going to be Chicago that was going to that was going to get him. At least from my perspective. Again, I don't have
Hmm.
as much inside knowledge as you do, but I'm thinking, I said, clearly, I thought he would have been, the number one guy. And when he began to slide down, and then the Falcons, I'm like, whoa,
Hmm.
what? That was something I did not see coming.
I think the whole thing with Michael Penix was that people were afraid of the injury history because he did. I
Mm,
mean, he did have 4 season-ending injuries in college, which is
yeah,
significant, right?
right.
But if you talk about skill for skill, there were not many quarterbacks in this draft class better than Michael Penix Jr.
Agreed.
That's just a fact. But a lot of teams kind of got down on the injury stuff, and also how he played in the national championship game. They just didn't love how he played in the national championship game either. But
Yeah.
again, it's like if you look at the numbers for the last 2 years in NCAA, he was he was kind of the best quarterback out there in terms of playing on the field. Maybe not, in some scouts' eyes, but he established himself as a winner for sure in college, and also an incredibly productive player as well on the field. So Falcons loved him. It was a controversial pick, but the cool thing about sports is that we get to find out, right? We get to find out what happens. We don't have to wonder forever. We get to see how it all plays out, and that's the exciting part.
Indeed, and like I said, we've seen some interesting situations how opportunities come knocking, and then if they're ready, great, and then
Hmm.
which means, hey, you're not getting your job back, and that's reality. We've seen it so many times throughout the
Yep.
course of history, with especially in the National Football League. But yeah,
It's a results based league. I mean, it
agreed.
really is, and that's stuff that people have to realize is that it's like if you don't produce,
Hmm.
you're gone. You have to produce results year in and year out. I mean, just the reality of it. Bill Belichick, didn't get brought back to New England, and
Yeah,
that's a guy that has a drawer full of championship rings, right? So, I mean, that's just how it is in the NFL.
NFL not for long, as they say, right?
Indeed,
Well,
indeed.
well, ladies and gentlemen, again, say hello to the bad guys. How Pro Wrestling's New World Order changed America. Again, you could pre-order it, like he said, Amazon, Target, the list. And go, again, go to his social media. You can click the links, order them. Will you be doing any book tours before we head out here? Will you be doing any book tours?
That's a great question. I've had discussions about it. There's nothing definitive just yet, but I would say tentatively, I think so. Yes.
Well, you definitely have my support on that. I'm definitely going to try my absolute best wherever you are, in close proximity to where I am, to ensure that I do, at least support and show up, definitely, because this has been one of the best interviews I had an opportunity to do, and I hope this is not the last. I hope we can do some more interviews in the future, whether it's pro wrestling, football, MMA, the whole nine yards.
100%. Just let me know. Thank you so much, man. I really appreciate it.
You got it.